Whereas chattel slavery, involving the theft and forced migration of African people to and around America, where they and their descendants were sold as property, was practiced in all 13 British colonies that form the basis of the United States. And that practice, with its inherent cruelty and brutality, continued through and beyond the founding of this nation, with the status and wealth of the nation thereby inextricably tied to the lives and labor of many millions of enslaved people. And whereas BIPOC communities in the United States have called for a national reckoning which acknowledges the need to create social equity, ensuring fair access to the benefits and opportunities of a prosperous society by addressing the myriad of harms caused by the oppressive and discriminatory laws. Therefore, be it resolved that in our commitment to work for a national reckoning in the United States through reparations, we collectively acknowledge the harm that has been done to BIPOC communities, and therefore be it resolved that we strive to join with BIPOC-led efforts in the United States to pursue policies and decisions that seek to have our country confront its history squarely and honestly, and to redress the many harms, particularly the persistent racial wealth gap caused by disparate access to opportunities and resources. And therefore be it resolved that we are committed to supporting and advocating for institutional, local, and federal legislation and policies that specifically address the need for reparations. These are excerpts from a resolution passed this week in support of reparations by Reconstructing Judaism, formerly known as the Reconstructionist Movement. They're the second Jewish movement following the Reform movement to take this stand. And while the conservative movement does not yet have a resolution under consideration, it has been the topic of study and consideration. For decades, the ideas of reparations have been slowly gaining momentum in communities and cities around the country. Earlier this month, as you know, St. Paul created the St. Paul Recovery Act Community Reparations Commission to address the harms caused to Black Americans, such as those living in the Rondo neighborhood by Minnesota, the harms caused by Minnesota and the city of St. Paul. A permanent 11-member group will advise the City Council how to address the damage caused by systemic racism and specifically for the descendants of chattel slavery. Now, as you well know, reparations are a big, complex, and controversial topic, and so since it's early, I have a lot of time to discuss it this morning. I can't do justice to it in one sermon, but I also can't pass up the opportunity to speak about it. I don't know if the Reconstructionist movement timed its announcement this week to correspond to this morning's Parsha, but Jewish thought on this issue begins here, and so it is to Parshat Bo that we must turn. But first, a bit of background and a disclaimer. The background. The National African American Commission on Reparations defines reparations as, quote, a process of repairing, healing, and restoring a people injured because of their group identity and in violation of their fundamental human rights. Reparations are not foreign to the United States. Though it doesn't make up for historical injustice, Native Americans received land and billions of dollars for being forcibly exiled from their native land. Japanese Americans interned during World War II received reparations amounting to $1.5 billion. And via the Marshall Plan, the U.S. helped ensure that Jews received reparations for the Holocaust in 1952, when West Germany agreed to pay 3.5 billion Deutsche Marks to survivors. The first major opportunity that the U.S. had and where it should have atoned for slavery was right after the Civil War. Union leaders, including General Sherman, concluded that each black family should receive 40 acres. Sherman signed Field Order 15 and allocated 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land to black families. Additionally, some families were to receive mules left over from the war, hence the term 40 acres and a mule. Unfortunately, after President Lincoln's assassination, President Johnson reversed Field Order 15 and returned land back to former slave owners. Instead of giving the blacks the means to support themselves, the federal government empowered former enslavers. For example, in Washington, D.C., slave owners were actually paid reparations themselves for lost property, that is to say, their formerly enslaved slaves. And so many black Americans with limited work options returned as sharecroppers to the same land for the very slave owners for whom they were once enslaved. Slave owners thus not only made money off of the chattel enslavement of black Americans, but then they made money multiple times off of the land that formerly enslaved had no choice but to work. There's obviously much more to say, but that will suffice as background for now. And now for the disclaimer. This is a charged and a complex topic. I firmly believe that good and caring and smart people can come to different conclusions on how to address systemic racism and historic injustice. And with all due respect to the Reconstructionist movement, this morning I'm not going to endorse the resolution. One more thing I'm also not going to do is to talk about the practical implications or the political ramifications, or if this is even a wise policy. All of those are legitimate, albeit perhaps secondary questions. There are plenty others who have much more insight than I who can address those issues. What I can do and will do is offer a brief overview from the Torah, beginning with our Parsha. We read in our Parsha, God said to Moshe, I will bring one more plague upon Pharaoh, and then he shall let you go. And when he does, go tell the Israelites to ask their Egyptian neighbors for objects of gold and silver. Thus you will strip the Egyptians. V'nitzaltem et Mitzrayim. Now that phrase in Hebrew, it's quite difficult to translate and open to many interpretations. Some say that means to despoil Egypt or empty Egypt out. It conjures in my mind an image of the Israelites taking revenge. I picture them ransacking or plundering Egypt, and such a response would have, of course, been understandable given what they had endured. But strikingly, no commentaries understand it that way or endorse revenge. They simply say, empty Egypt out of its gold. I want to explore what's behind this transfer of wealth and understand it in three critical ways that I believe address past wrongs and lay the groundwork for the Israelites' prosperous future. They are reckoning, restitution, and repair. And so let's look at each one. First, reckoning. Now, if we look closely in our Parsha, the Torah doesn't say that the Jews took the gold and silver. Rather, God says, Vayishalehu, from the word she'ilah, bish'ol. Go and ask your neighbor for gold and silver. After all that they had been through, it would have made sense if they simply took the gold, but instead the Torah says, ask for it. I understand this requirement to ask along the lines of what Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote back in 2014 in his thought-provoking article, The Case for Reparations. He explained that, among other things, reparations create the opportunity for, quote, the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. The full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. In other words, picture this. It wasn't an Israelite knocking on the door of his Egyptian neighbor and says, I'm leaving now. Do you have any gold and silver I can borrow? Rather, do you understand what you've done? You who were once so welcoming to strangers, you who take pride in this golden Medina, do you understand and recognize how you have become so prosperous? In other words, by asking and not just taking the gold, perhaps the Israelites were inviting the Egyptians to wrestle with and reconcile with their past as enslavers. There's reckoning and next restitution. While no amount of money could make up for centuries of dehumanizing slave labor, receiving the gold and silver was an act of restitution. The rabbis of the Talmud imagine a time many years later when Jews were once again living in Alexandria, and an Egyptian came forward to sue the Jews in the court of Alexander the Great. They said, "You owe us for all the gold and silver that you took on your way out of Egypt." Kind of chutzpah, no? Well, the Jewish defense attorney, he countersued, and he said, "You owe us for payment of 600,000 men, women, and children who were forced to be slaves for 430 years. What happened? The Egyptians dropped the case. Egypt had exploited the Israelites for hundreds of years, stealing their labor. In the human and, I would say, in the divine court, this money was owed to them. Reckoning, restitution, and lastly, repair. When God first spoke to Moshe at the burning bush, God already said back then, "I will stretch out my hand and I will smite the Egyptians. Pharaoh will let you go, but you will not leave empty-handed. Lo telchu rekam." Now, this promise, you will not leave empty-handed, it wasn't just a way of offering the Israelites a measure of comfort. Yes, you're going to work hard, but don't worry, you'll be compensated. It was a way to ensure their prosperous future. We know that because the same phrase is used later in the book of Deuteronomy, where we are told, if a fellow Hebrew is sold to you, he shall serve for 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go free. Do not let him go empty-handed. Now, in this scenario, a person sells himself into slavery to pay off his debts. He is to work for 6 years, and his master have every right to make him work. Then along comes the 7th year. If he has paid off his debt, but he had no way to rebuild his life, he probably would find him back in the same situation. And so the Torah commands, do not let him go out empty-handed. Rashi sharpens the link between the Israelites' liberation from Egyptian slavery and this directive that's directed towards Jewish slave owners themselves. Rashi writes, "Just as you received spoils from Egypt, so must you provide for your slave." My colleague, Rabbi Aryeh Bernstein, drew out the implication in a 2018 article, "The Torah's Case for Reparations." He wrote, "The Torah does not frame the Israelites' taking of Egyptian reparations as only a historical footnote of their past liberation, but as a core component of divine law moving forward. As the Torah prepares the Israelites for life in the land of Israel as an independent nation, God warns them of the proper way to transition vulnerable and dependent indentured servants to freedom. Just as our ancestors were rescued from slavery with reparations bountiful enough to build long-term financial sustainability, our free society," Bernstein concludes, "is commanded to ensure the same for those plunged into economic subordination, so that temporary poorness never becomes structural poverty." I'm not moved by revenge, nor is that what the Torah commands, but reckoning, restitution, and repair. These are critical components of repentance, tshuva. They're basic to the pursuit of tzedek, justice, and central to the notion of tikkun. Now, I don't know how to move from machshava to halakha, from theology to policy, from ideal to practical. What I do know is what we read in our Torah and what we say every Shabbat in our tefillot, zecher li'yitziat Mitzrayim. We're commanded to remember the Exodus from Egypt. What are we to remember? Not just God's miracles and God's outstretched arm, not just the bitterness of slavery and the joy of liberation, but we are to remember that without reckoning, restitution, and repair, there can be no redemption. Without reparation, there can be no liberation. Shabbat Shalom. Good to you. Turn back in our Sidrim, Amud 155, page 155.